told you the first Americans came from Asia. They told you they walked across a frozen land bridge 12,000 years ago. They showed you pictures of light-skinned native tribes in feathers and beads, and they never mentioned a thing about black people. But what if everything you were taught was a lie? What if long before Columbus, before the slave ships, before even the so-called First Nations, there were black civilizations on American soil? This isn't a conspiracy. This is buried history, proven by ancient skulls, forbidden artifacts, and DNA evidence they hope you'll never see. Massive stone heads with unmistakable African features. Ancient remains with African genetic markers found deep in the Americas, and colonial journals describing encounters with dark-skinned, woolly-haired people before slavery ever began. So why isn't any of this in your history books? Because if black people were already here, if they were the first Americans, then everything changes. Who owns the land? Who has ancestral rights? Who really built the foundation of this nation? In this video, we reveal the explosive evidence that could rewrite American history. Not just where it started, but who it started with. They erased them from the textbooks. They renamed them. They buried their bones and stole their names. But the truth, it never disappeared. And tonight, we're digging it up. You were taught that the first people in America came here from Asia. They crossed a frozen land bridge from Siberia to Alaska during the last ice age. Nomadic tribes chasing mammoths, dressed in furs, huddled in caves. That's the version in your textbooks. That's the version in museums. That's the version on every school quiz and standardized test. But what if it's not the whole story? For over a century, we've been fed the Clovis First theory, that humans arrived in North America around 12,000 years ago, no earlier, that they were Asian in origin, and that no one was here before them. This narrative became gospel in academia. To question it was academic suicide. But here's the thing. The evidence never fully supported it. There are archaeological sites across the Americas that date long before 12,000 years ago. Sites in South Carolina, Mexico, and even Brazil that contain tools, bones, and structures thousands of years older than the official timeline allows. But rather than admit they were wrong, the institutions doubled down. Because if people were in the Americas before 1580, the so-called first Americans, then the whole foundation of American history cracks. And it gets deeper. Because the version you were taught didn't just distort the when, it distorted the who. We've been shown images of red-skinned, feathered tribes. We've heard stories about peaceful nomads and noble savages. And while indigenous people absolutely have deep roots here, the image we were given was incomplete. What you weren't told is that early European explorers described encountering black native tribes with dark skin, woolly hair, and African features. They were here when the Spanish came. They were here when the English landed. They were here before any African slave ships arrived. So why aren't they mentioned in your history books? Because this version of history, neat, controlled, and whitewashed, leaves no room for the truth, that black people may have been here first. That challenges everything. It challenges race. It challenges property. It challenges the idea of who belongs where. Because if black nations existed on American soil before Columbus, before the slave trade, before the reclassification of identity, then the foundation of American history isn't built on immigration. It's built on erasure. They didn't just erase what happened. They erased who it happened to. And this lie isn't just academic. It's personal. It shaped laws, land rights, identity, and generational trauma. But now the truth is rising from the ruins. Some were found in the Mississippi Valley, others in Central America, some even along the coast of California. Then there's the architecture, pyramids, mounds, and monuments built with astronomical precision long before Europeans arrived. Structures aligned with stars, solstices, and planetary movements, built by people with math, calendars, and engineering knowledge that shouldn't have existed, according to the mainstream. So how did they explain it? They didn't. Instead, they buried it. Literally. Entire sites have been shut down, covered up, or handed off to institutions that keep the public out. Researchers who tried to speak up were labeled fringe, unqualified, or crazy. But the evidence doesn't lie. It's in the earth, in the stones, in the bones, in the very soil America was built on. And if black people were here before anyone else, if they built civilizations, left monuments, and buried their dead on this land, then the real story of America didn't start with slavery. It started with sovereignty. And that's exactly what they didn't want you to know. Because if black people were already here, they weren't just stolen from Africa. They were erased from their own land. In the next part, we look at what the DNA says, and how genetic evidence backs up what archaeologists were punished for even suggesting, because the science doesn't lie, but the system does. You've probably seen the ads: trace your ancestry, discover where you really come from, unlock your ethnic identity. It sounds empowering, scientific, liberating. But when it comes to the question, who were the first Americans? DNA companies suddenly go silent. Why? Because the real story DNA tells doesn't match the one they're selling. Let's start with something simple. Mitochondrial DNA. Passed from mother to child, unchanged. It's how we trace maternal lineage back through time. Now, here's the bombshell. Several ancient remains found in the Americas, especially in the southeastern US, carry mitochondrial haplogroups linked to sub-Saharan Africa. In plain English, their mothers, way back, came from Africa, and not through slavery. Long before, but you won't hear that on your ancestry report, or see it in the National Geographic timeline, because that truth is considered disruptive. Then there's the Y-DNA, paternal lineage. Tribes once considered purely Native American are showing genetic markers more commonly found in African populations, and we're not talking about modern African American blending. We're talking ancient markers, embedded deep in the bloodline. This shows up again and again in tribes like the Yamasee, Blackfoot, Washita, and Seminole, groups with oral histories and cultural traditions that include African connections long before European contact. So why aren't DNA companies talking about this? Because it breaks the script. It would mean that black Americans didn't all arrive by boat. Some were already here, with roots in the land going back thousands of years. And that changes everything. It changes what Native American means. It changes who has indigenous rights. It challenges the narrative of stolen people from Africa, because it reveals a stolen land from black people already here. Here's another secret. In the next part, we uncover the artifacts they hid. The ancient faces carved in stone, the bones that tell a different story, the physical proof that America's first people may not have looked like the ones you saw in cartoons. But like you, they say the evidence isn't there, that black people in ancient America is just a myth, a theory with no proof, a fantasy. But the evidence is there. It's just been ignored, misclassified, or hidden. Let's start with the most obvious, the Olmec heads, carved out of stone, some over 9 feet tall and weighing up to 40 tons. These massive monuments were created over 3,000 years ago in what's now Mexico, long before the Aztecs or Mayans, and their faces, broad noses, full lips, deep-set eyes, features that clearly resemble people of African descent. Mainstream historians called them stylized. They called them coincidental. But they never explained why early Mesoamerican cultures would carve statues of people who supposedly hadn't arrived yet. Next, let's talk about Lucia woman. Discovered in Brazil in the 1970s, Lucia is one of the oldest human remains ever found in the Americas, estimated to be over 11,000 years old. But her skull didn't resemble East Asians like the Bering Strait theory suggests. Her facial structure, bone density, and features were closer to sub-Saharan Africans and Aboriginal Australians. Let that sink in. The oldest human found in the Americas doesn't match the official version of the first Americans. She looks black, and Lucia isn't alone. Across North and South America, similar remains with African traits have been discovered and quietly disappeared. Some were destroyed, some were reclassified, some were locked away in museum basements, never to be displayed. And then there are the artifacts. African-style spears, tools, and pottery found in places where no Africans were supposed to be, before Columbus, before the transatlantic slave trade. Many black Americans who take DNA tests report something strange. Their African ancestry is underreported or vague, broadly West African, and their native ancestry is often missing altogether, even if their families have known indigenous roots. How does that make sense? Simple. These DNA companies rely on modern reference populations, not ancient ones. So if your ancestors were indigenous people who were reclassified as colored or Negro, or if they were part of a now extinct or hidden tribe with African roots, you'll get a false result. The system will say, you're African, maybe a little European, but it won't say, you're indigenous, you were already here. Because that admission, that opens the floodgates to land claims, to identity, to reparations, to truth. The very fabric of American history is based on erasing this connection. Because once you connect African to indigenous, the lie falls apart. So the science is there, but they don't talk about it. They suppress it, they twist it, or they bury it under the convenient phrase, inconclusive. But your DNA doesn't lie, only the people interpreting it do. And if we listen closely to the bloodline, it's not just whispering where you came from, it's screaming who they tried to erase. In the next part, we'll show how colonial records and first-hand explorer accounts confirm what the bones and blood already tell us. America's first people didn't just come from Africa, some of them were already here. What if the history books didn't just forget about black people in early America? What if they deliberately erased them? Because the truth is, the earliest European explorers didn't just encounter other Indians, they documented tribes with dark skin, woolly hair, and African features, and they wrote about them until those writings were buried. Let's go back to the 1500s, when Spanish explorers like Hernando de Soto and Vasco Núñez de Balboa traveled through the southeastern U.S. They recorded encounters with indigenous tribes who looked nothing like the native image taught in school. They wrote about black-skinned people with broad noses and full lips, living in organized societies, farming, governing, building temples, long before contact with Africa or Europe. Some reports even mentioned indigenous leaders with skin as black as coal. And these weren't slaves. These were natives of the land. Then there's Benjamin Franklin, who once referred to the American Indians as being similar in color to Africans, not Asians as the land bridge theory suggests. What happened to those accounts? They were ignored, discredited, or erased in the centuries that followed. By the 1800s, as race-based slavery took root, it became politically useful to redraw the narrative. Black became synonymous with slave. Native became synonymous with red. And the black tribes of America were quietly erased. Let's talk about some of those tribes. The Yamasee, originally from the southeast, Georgia and South Carolina, described as dark-skinned with African features. After colonization, they were forcibly removed or reclassified as Negroes in census records. The Washita Nation, recognized by the United Nations in the 1990s as Indigenous People of North America, their oral history traces their ancestry back thousands of years, claiming to be descendants of prehistoric African settlers. The Black Seminoles, an alliance of African-descended people and Native Americans in Florida. They fought U.S. forces in the Seminole Wars, not as runaway slaves, but as free people defending their homeland. All of these groups had their tribal status stripped, their lands stolen, and their identities rewritten in courtrooms, censuses, and textbooks. Once listed as Indian, they were relabeled black, colored, Negro, or freedmen. Why? Because if the government had acknowledged their indigenous roots, it would have owed them land, sovereignty, and reparations. Instead, it erased them. And the erasure didn't stop at the records. It reached into the classrooms, into the family tree, into your own understanding of where you come from. Ask your elders. Many black families in the South will tell you, we're part Cherokee, or Grandma was Creek. But when you search the ancestry sites, it disappears, because the truth was buried and replaced.